Welcome to the DRS Train podcast. This service is 1976 without Hunt and Lauda. I'm your driver, Peter Brook, and your conductors today are Nav F1 and returning guest DanNoSkill. Good day, gentlemen.
Hi, Peter. Let's look at this famous season without the two protagonists.
Hello, Peter. Thank you for having me back on again. Looking forward to this one.
So the idea for this came that we thought we would look at seasons which have essentially been defined by their title battles, but then look at everything except the title battle. So you can do the same with things like 1988, 2016, 2006, 2021 even. So basically, today we're going to talk about 1976, but we're not allowed to talk about Lauda or Hunt and their battle. And so I think a good place to start is the driver and the team that finished third in 76, which was Jody Scheckter and Tyrrell, who of course had the famous six-wheeler. So around this time, this was a period of huge innovation and technological change in Formula One, because in the following year in 77, we saw the first ground effect car and the first turbocharged car. The year before that, we got our first six-wheeler, which had its pros and cons, but unlike the other two, it didn't really kick off in the same way, did it?
It's interesting you say that because at first, because of the Tyrrell's results, it was said that a lot of other teams were looking at designs, and there are prototypes just getting talked about on the internet. You can find some pictures. Apparently, Ferrari and McLaren were also looking at making six-wheeled cars, and then in the end, just didn't get around to completing it. So it's interesting to think that there is a timeline where in the 80s, everyone is using six-wheeled cars.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because I guess after this season in 76, you would think more teams would start adopting it, seeing as, like you said, they finished third place and had a couple strong results. Then, like Nav said, there was a couple prototypes, but the next sort of big news of a six-wheeled car wouldn't be till the Williams in the 80s, when eventually six wheels would get banned from F1 because that car looked really, really good. But yeah, it's interesting that kind of after the lackluster season of 77 the car had, and wasn't it some sort of tire issues as well, it wouldn't really make a return into F1 properly.
Yeah, so just to give an explanation of why they did this, the two of the major technical changes that came in 76 were the banning of those enormous overhead air boxes that they used to have. When you see 75, the Ligier, I think, or the Tyrrell, the Ligier had a particularly large one that had that kind of teapot look to it. But they, as well as that, they'd also limited the width of the front wing to 1.5 meters, which meant it now went inboard of the front wheels, which created a lot of dirty air from the wheels. And so Tyrrell decided to get around this by making two pairs of small wheels instead of just one pair of big ones. And so that was that was how they came up with this concept of a six-wheeler, because again, there was nothing in the rules that said the cars had to have four wheels. They kept it they were very secretive about it though, and the drivers didn't even know what they were doing until the car was unveiled at its launch. And it had, at the time, because Depailler really liked the car, Scheckter at the time wasn't such a big fan of it, although he's given kind of a contradictory account since then, because more recently, because he actually has the P34 as one of his collection of cars that he's bought in retirement. He said that it broke a lot, but also it had insane levels of front end grip, and you could just throw the car into corners and it would do exactly what you wanted. But as a counter to that, it had the brakes often got very hot because they were very small disc brakes. And it was even just a manufacturing issue because it was like 16-inch rims, which no other team were using. But it just never. Other people tried, they were the only ones to do other people tried, like March and Ferrari and then Williams did two pairs of rear wheels, which did seem to work better, but yeah, it just never really kicked off.
Yeah, and Depailler was always a testing gear driver. He always liked testing, and he seemed to criticize Scheckter for at least not testing a lot with that Tyrrell, which needed that. Depailler also was one of the main advocates for the Tyrrell being the car for 1976. So when Ken Tyrrell wasn't too sure about it, Depailler said, "No, we should go for this. This is how you make waves, and this is how you really make an impact." And it definitely did. I think in the 70s, that Tyrrell P34 and the Brabham fan car of 1978 are two of the most famous cars now for their designs. And it's even better when the car actually performed. It won a race, and I think it got more than 10 podiums. So it was definitely a contender, not just a car for show and looks.
It It's good that we mentioned that they won the race, because I think that's like a really big stepping point for the car, because it was consistently on the podium. If you look at between Scheckter and Depailler was on the podium 7 times over the season, and Scheckter on there 5 times, including his win. So it was clearly a front-running car capable of maybe not challenging every time for the wins when we think about the dominant cars of 1976, but if it had the right opportunity, it could definitely take advantage of that. So it's a really interesting one to look at. And I do think, Peter, I'm going to ask you the question because you might know a bit more about this. Why do you think no other teams decided to push the 6-wheel car much further until obviously Williams in the 80s ended up getting it banned?
I think it was partly keeping it within the rules was tricky in terms of width and wheelbase requirements, but also just sort of some of the downsides of it, because the main issue with having it on the front wheels like they did was because, again, it put a lot of strain on the tires because they were very small. I mean, I said 16 is actually 10-inch diameter wheels, and the brakes got really hot. But when March the following year tried to do 2 pairs of rear wheels, the problem they had was that it meant a very complex system of differentials and drive shafts, which used to damage the gearbox. And that was the main reason that they scrapped that. Ferrari tried putting 2 pairs of wheels on the same axle, but that was illegal because it was far too wide. It just did. I think it by the time ground effect had come into play, it didn't really make much difference if it was 4 or 6 wheels, because by then that had regained so much of the grip they were trying to find. I mean, because 82 with the Williams cars, they combined 6 wheels with ground effect. I've forgotten the exact reasons why people, because some other teams protested it, and then it was then that FIA said, okay, the cars must have 4 wheels. But I think there were also, the main reason they protested was on safety grounds, because they'll say, well, in pit stops it's going to be chaotic trying to change 6 wheels on a car instead of 4. Yeah, it just didn't cotton on. I mean, by 1977 they were still using the P34 with modifications, and it wasn't anywhere near as good by then. And I think because they were the only people using 10-inch diameter tires, they weren't being produced much by Goodyear, so they just didn't have many in stock as the only team using them.
Yeah, interesting then. So I suppose just by the time ground effect came in, it sort of nullified it. And then I remember as well reading about that Williams, as well as it being banned sort of on protest and safety grounds, there was also the fact that if you put the 2 rear wheels at the back, does it then technically classify it as 4-wheel drive? Because obviously all 4 of the rear wheels are providing drive to the car, which was already banned under the F1 regulation.
I never thought of that, but I guess that would technically count, because we'd had in the early 60s there was a 4-wheel drive car. I think it was Ferguson made it, the Ferguson P16. I think that was a 4-wheel drive car, and that's the only other time we've seen them. And it doesn't really work for most forms of non-rallying racing for whatever reason. Yeah, that's probably another reason. But yeah, I think most of it, to be honest, was the other team seeing, oh well, they've come up with this new brainwave and it's going to be amazing, so we just need to stop it.
Yeah.
But I would have liked to have seen someone do both. So we had an 8-wheeled car, so 2 pairs on the front and the back. But that, I think, yeah, the even so, the 4-wheel one, that must have created havoc with getting like the toe angle and the camber, because they would have had to been fixed, and you would have had, it must have created understeer having two pairs of rear wheels, because they would have needed different toe angles. The differentials would have had to been different as well, because it's
You
like
would
at
have had
that
to
point,
drift a lot.
yeah, because at that point it becomes like the bogey on a train, and that in that sense. But yeah, it would have been drifting a lot, but which by the 80s they weren't doing anymore because they didn't need to because of ground effect. So it's a funny one. But yeah, it was obviously at the time it was obviously good because they got the win, and it was clearly, with all the podiums, it was clearly best of the rest behind they who shall not be named. Yeah,
And looking at the drivers a bit more, Jody Scheckter and Depailler. Obviously, Scheckter becomes a champion 3 years later. He didn't like the cars, he said, but then he comes back on his words and he says that it wasn't that bad. I think a driver who doesn't get mentioned a lot from that era is partly because of how many good drivers there were in the 70s, but also because of how many good French drivers there were in the next few years. Depailler had a good year, and the thing is, he had a lot of DNFs as well. So At the time, he was seen by his peers as maybe a bit reckless, even though he would always say, he has a famous quote that if you give him a good car, his job is to not bin it. But still, he had 6 DNFs in 1976. Not all were his fault, there were also technical issues. And, he never really drove cars that were that good again. In 1979, actually, he was in the Ligier, that was a title contender for most of the season, but he breaks his legs in a hang gliding accident, and that's his career done. And I remember seeing that Guy Ligier was extremely annoyed at him for that. And I mean, why wouldn't you be? If you have a car that is a title contender, you would want the two drivers to take care of themselves and not just get an accident elsewhere. So he dies in 1980. And many people think that he could have won many more races, maybe 7 or 8 races. I think he only had 2 wins when he died, including a win at Monaco. But yeah, he's a driver who doesn't get remembered because of a shorter career, because of his nationality. When I think he was the first French driver to perhaps lead a championship. Some people say Jean Bérin maybe did for a bit in 1956, but I think he was the first one where you could clearly see in the news French driver leading the F1 standings.
I think things like that skydiving accident is the reason that for Max Verstappen, his contract says he's not allowed to do any dangerous sports such as skiing or anything extreme like that. But yeah, Dupaille, he came just before we got like Lafitte, Arnoux, Jarier, Jabouille, Prost, and then Tombay and Pironi. Suddenly, this avalanche of French drivers kind of coming in, like basically just after he died, and he gets lost in the crowd a bit because of that, I think.
Yeah, looking at Dupaille's season, he wasn't too bad. I think, like Nav said, he had the 6 DNFs, which is 2 more than Scheckter had, which in the end, combined with Schecter's win, I think that consistency of just being able to finish in the points more often is what gave Scheckter the advantage in the championship. Obviously, even at one point, Scheckter was able to challenge for second place in the championship. But Dupaille was consistently on the podium. So when he did finish, he was fast. There was a couple races, two where he dropped out the points when he did finish, and one where he finished in 6th, which would have been 1 point at the time. But the rest, all of them on the podium, which kind of shows that on his day, he was a quick driver and like Nav said, reasonably talented.
I think I'll give a quick mention because it's on the slide that there was a second Scheckter that year, Ian. He older brother of Jody, not nearly as well known. It's one of these sort of divides when you get siblings or fathers and sons in F1 where there's one that's amazing and the other one less so. And him, 76, he did one race for Tyrrell, but that was actually in the 007, the previous car, so he never drove the 6-wheeler. But he then did get to do a whole season with March in 77, though didn't get any points. Okay, so let's move on to the next team, Ferrari. Now, obviously, we're not allowed to talk about their lead driver, but they did have Record-Sony in the second seat. He himself was never really a title contender, much more inconsistent. He finished 5th in the title and only got 1 win with 4 podiums. But this was the 312 T2, and it was a good car in 75 because Lauda dominated the championship as they just kind of continued in what was obviously the best car, but just circumstances meant they didn't win the title.
Well, just be blunt about this. Why do you guys think that Regazzoni had such a lackluster year in terms of performances and points? We see it a bit in the movie, but let's talk about the actual stats.
It's a tough one because you look, and at some races, you talked about Long Beach. Well, it's on the slide, sorry, Long Beach, where he got pole and fastest lap and the win. So, like a very dominant win early on there for him. But then from there, the season just seems to fall away with a couple DNFs, but actually just a lot of finishes in the lower end of the points or out of the points. I would imagine we know Regazzoni when he joined F1 was a little bit older anyway. So that could be a factor just as he ages, getting a little bit worse with age. But there's probably also elements of bad luck in there. thinking, obviously in the 70s as it was easy to suffer from bad luck. But Peter, if you know anything about like mechanical issues they actually had, or whether it was just a lack of pace on his end.
I mean, I don't think it was a particularly bad car mechanically. I mean, this was his third year now with Ferrari, and he'd gone from being runner-up to then 75 really was not a good year as well, because he got only one. He had a lot of non-points finishes and took only one win, and that was a year dominated by Lauda. I think maybe it was just second driver syndrome, that Lauda was the lead driver and he would have a tendency to kind of vacuum in all of the team support and all of the resources that he needed. And now maybe just being not as good. I think that was, just basically getting the scraps from what was left over by Lauda.
Yeah, seems like that could be the case. We know as well, obviously, Lauda was very good with his technical feedback on the car. So whether he pushes development more in his way and it doesn't suit Regazzoni as much could be another reason. There's also, Nav, I know you wanted to touch on McLaren and Jochen Mass as well, who was their second driver. His season wasn't the greatest either, and he looked like he lacked a bit of pace, because you look how close Tyrrell are to McLaren in the team standing, constructor standing, and you think that maybe Mass wasn't pulling his weight completely. So what's your opinion on that?
I just found it interesting because Mass was a decent driver. He wasn't a world beater, but he was a respectable driver. So he nearly cost James Hunt his title, basically, because when Lauda gets injured, you would expect the second driver to start getting better results and just basically assist James a bit more. But obviously Hunt was winning the races, but when Lauda eventually came back and McLaren had a good car, Mass wasn't there to, compete with Lauda. And that could have made everything different. So a lot of people talk about Regazzoni because he was more famous. He's also more prominent in the Rush movie. And obviously he wins a race with a very dominant pole in Long Beach. But I can't help but think, if McLaren had a better second driver, it could have been over even earlier.
Been around for a while at this point. I mean, he's known by most people. He took that win in '75 again at the Spanish Grand Prix. Bit of a fluke win in the end. But then most people remember him for '82 because obviously he was the one involved in Gilles Villeneuve's fatal accident, and a lot of people blamed him for that. But he had quite a long career afterwards in sports cars. I mean, he won Le Mans a few times with Sauber, and he was still going up until then. So a lot of longevity, but it just never really fully landed in Formula One.
It's interesting you talk about longevity because Regazzoni was synonymous with Ferrari for so many years. He was the longest serving driver for Ferrari when he retired, and that wouldn't be broken until Alboreto. So Regazzoni, he as I said, he was famous for coming second in the championship title in 1974 to Fittipaldi. Fittipaldi, who, just after winning his championship, decided that he should leave any competitive team and go help his brother. So that moves on to our next segment about Fittipaldi and Penske, two of the weirder cars, I would say, for different reasons. Fittipaldi, just because it now had one of the best drivers of the decade driving there in a backmarker, and Penske because they had an unlikely winner in the form of John Watson.
Yeah, Penske are an interesting one because this is a name that's really well known in America because Roger Penske founded the team. He did a lot of racing himself. He did a few races in Formula One as well as the Indy 500. Penske's had a lot of success in IndyCar over the years, but they had this brief appearance in Formula One where they appeared briefly for 2 races in '71 running a McLaren. Then they built their own car for the final 2 races of '74, and then they did '75. And then '76 was their final year, again, building their own cars by this point. And they took this one win in Austria with John Watson. This was during Lauda's convalescence when he was absent, because you think if it's Austria, surely it would have been Lauda that would have won it. So I guess a bit of a lucky win, but obviously a reasonably good car because there were 2 other podiums as well and a couple of other points. But then for whatever reason, they just pulled the plug after that. And then for a couple of years, other people used their cars as customer, smaller teams, but they just gave up on Formula One very quickly.
Yes, it's interesting you mentioned the win in Austria as well, because during that race, Andretti and Lotus were leading for a lot of it. and it was close to lead, but as was most races in the 70s. And then they suffered an engine issue and dropped out, and that led to John Watson taking the lead. So it's debatable whether really Penske had a race-winning car. They obviously were on the podium other times, but if it actually was ever going to be up there challenging for wins consistently is up to them. Only time would have told. But yeah, it seemed like a relatively strong season from them to, start pushing that car towards the front of the grid. So why they would leave F1 after that, especially after achieving their first win, is confusing to me. I don't know if you guys have any answers to that one.
My only assumption is because they were more heavily invested in IndyCar, but this was a time, 70s in particular, there were loads of teams that would come and go, and because you could build a car on the cheap. It wouldn't be a very good one, but it would still be good enough to get in and start a race. And there were lots of teams that would come and go and maybe do half a season at the most, and then just give it up. But yeah, this was one of those. Even though it came quite a big name, maybe most of their funding was just on the IndyCar project.
Yeah, it was a big name with big drivers. John Watson, who went on to have a very good career, nearly won the 1982 title. Well, just like 9 other drivers, basically. But it's very accurate what you said about the 70s, how teams would just come and go without a lot of funding. It was very easy to set up a team and just have a go, which is exactly what Emerson Fittipaldi's brother did with the Copersucar Fittipaldi, Brazilian state-backed, of course. And the aim was basically to have, well, what Super Aguri had and what Ligier had, what Renault had, which is full representation of the country it's from. Fittipaldi wanted to be a Brazilian car with Brazilian drivers who would win in Brazil and just make Brazil a dominant force in Formula One. Because we need to remember, in the 70s, Brazil wasn't the motorsport country it is. Well, the motorsport country we remember now. There was no Senna, Barrichello, and all those drivers. Fittipaldi was the first person to really put it on the map. So I think he thought it could be a legacy moment for him if he joined his brother's team and perhaps won races in a car that had his name. But obviously that would never happen, and his best result would be 1978, just a second place. And so many people wonder, why would he take that risk? You can be patriotic, but when you're at the height of your powers, why would you just go to a backmarker for no reason when not being forced to do so?
We've seen this a lot of ex-drivers or current drivers, even a lot of champions notably, making their own teams, and it very rarely works. Because we've seen, so Jack Brabham did it, Surtees, obviously Fittipaldi, Graham Hill, and then even Jackie Stewart and Alan Prost have all made their own teams, Chris Amon too, and it just doesn't, none of them were really, other than Brabham, none of them were actually really successful. But this one, obviously, they did try to push on the Brazilian side because they had, Fittipaldi raced with them for 5 or 6 years. And then they brought in Ingo Hoffmann, who he was a 12-time Brazilian stock car champion. So he was a very well-known name in Brazil, but just didn't happen in Formula One. There was Alex Ribeiro. And then towards the end, they had, after Fittipaldi left, they brought in Keke Rosberg, who was a rookie, and he would go on to be a champion. But yeah, the odd podium here and there, but as it went on, they just the number of failures to qualify creeped in, and it just never. It lasted a long time, but just never really worked.
It's a bit of a sad story, isn't it? Because, well, you can see it in two ways, I suppose. You can see it as a sad story because Fittipaldi, as demonstrated in the early 70s, was quite clearly an extremely talented driver, and then to kind of have him stuck in a backmarker team that was never really able to go anywhere is wasted talent on one hand, but on the other hand, you see a lot of world champions need another challenge to go back to the front. I mean, we could compare to something more recent like Schumacher. He won 2 championships with Benetton, and then it was like, well, I've proven myself that I'm a Formula One world champion. Everyone knows I'm a good driver. Now I need another challenge of bringing glory back to Ferrari in that instance, and then later in his career when he tried to build up the Mercedes team a little bit more. So I guess it could be a similar thing with Fittipaldi, where it's like, well, I've conquered one challenge of becoming Formula One world champion and solidifying myself as the next best driver after Jackie Stewart retired. But then it could also be, well, I need a new challenge, which is to bring some glory to my country and start trying to improve things for them in motorsport.
Yeah, it's
That's a small thing. Sorry, just that's a small thing, but we mentioned it in a previous episode. How many titles do you think Fittipaldi could have won if he had stayed at McLaren then?
not 75, because Ferrari were just dominant. 76, well, I think he's a better driver than Hunt. And if we assume that Lauda's accident still happens, then yes, 76, absolutely. The thing is, beyond that, it really wasn't. It really wasn't a good time for McLaren. He probably would have moved somewhere else. I mean, I don't know if he would have he possibly even Ferrari after Lauda quit for 78. But it was just a huge mistake, and it's the kind of thing that I could justify it if it was like 1980 when he made this decision, because in 75, okay, he won 2 titles with 2 different teams, but he'd only been in Formula One for 5 years at that point, and he was still only in his like late 20s. But 1980 when he retired, he was early 30s, and he'd been around for 10 years. It's like at that point, maybe let's try this as a sort of retirement idea. It did really damage his career record considerably, I think, to spend so long in such a mediocre team.
Yeah, I think I agree with you that I reckon if he had stayed with McLaren, then 76 would have also been his. Again, you'd have to see what happens in his career. You can only sort of push these alternate histories so far before you have to start speculating on everything else, as there was so many driver moves back then. But yeah, I have to agree with you that career-wise, it was not the best choice. But maybe fulfillment-wise, if it had worked, he would have been looked upon in such high regard. But unfortunately, it just didn't, which I suppose is the risk you're always taking in Formula One.
I mean, he had plenty left in him because he retired in 1980, but he was still racing. He went on to IndyCar and won that a few times, and he was still doing that into the early 90s. I mean, I don't think he wouldn't have done that with Formula One because nobody's had a career that long, well, except Fernando Alonso's getting there. But he could have carried on until the mid 80s if he'd been in better teams or whatever. But by this point, his decision to retire at the end of 80 was, he said, it was too difficult to race and run the team, but also maybe he just didn't enjoy the car being just not very good. But yeah. So moving on. Next up is Ligier. So this was their first year, and it was 70. This is their second year. So they joined in 75, and they've become the first French team for 4 or 5 years at this point. But they had just one driver, so which by that point was becoming less and less common.
Yeah, so they had Jacques Lafitte, who would prove himself as a good driver, maybe even a very good driver, never really world champion material, even though he was involved in 2 championship fights in 79 and 81. Ligier was basically born from the acquisition of Matra F1's assets, who was also a very good team. They were extremely French with a typical and notable blue livery. And they, of course, gave a title to Jackie Stewart. Well, they gave a card to Jackie Stewart for his 1969 title, who was also always very involved with the French machinery and drivers and engineers. So Matra, after some financial trouble, sells their assets to Ligier. And Guy Ligier, who was a guy who was involved in a lot of different forays. He had a construction company. He used to be a rugby player, and then he eventually goes into motorsport. He buys the team and he puts Jacques Lafitte in that car. And honestly, I think it's quite impressive that he got 3 podiums in the very first year. So obviously the engine was still Matra and he didn't start from scratch, but still having new engineers and just having new contenders to work with. Lafitte, who was still, he hadn't really made his mark yet. Well, Ligier proved that they would be a contender for the years to come. And what's interesting is the first 5 years of Ligier's history were the most successful, because after 1980 it just went downhill.
Yeah, with Ligier's first season and Lafitte driving for them, I think he proved that they had the potential to build a good car, because when you look at the strong finishes with no issues, you can see that for the most part, he's in the points, if not on the podium. It was just the season was played with issues and DNFs and then a couple poor results here and there as well. So it's like those teething problems in F1 where you can see that there could be something special there. It's just about maybe taking a bit more time from the first season to work on reliability and get everything in the team gelling well together. But other than that, a reasonably strong first season for them. And yeah, they were sort of, I think, a bit of a surprise to people watching in this year.
Yeah, they should have really been higher than 6th. the constructors with 3 podiums and a pole position, but of course that was because they had only one driver, so they were dependent on him for all of their results. But yeah, it was a very good year. I mean, they started relatively strongly, Ligier, because by the ground effect era at 79.80, they had arguably the strongest car. It just broke a lot. Was the problem, which took a lot of wins, and they had issues that the ground effect was so strong that it used to flex the suspension because it was just trying to suck the car almost into the ground. But they went on for 20 years and didn't. It just never quite happened. They had the odd win here and there, and yeah, ground effect good, but then turbo era not so good. By the 90s, they were just a midfielder, and then Harness got that win in 96 as their sort of swan song before they became Prost, which ended up basically being a train wreck of a campaign. It just never. It started with promise, but it just never really happened in the end.
It's interesting also that, well, because Ligier was such a good people's person, he would make a lot of links, especially during his previous careers. And one of the people he got close to was François Mitterrand, who became the French president in the 1980s. When Ligier started getting into trouble, when they lost Matra as an engine supplier and they had to use, I think it was Ford in 92 and 93, the performance completely dipped. And they had a big issue in terms of who would give them an engine. And the French government basically forced Renault to give them their engine, and suddenly the performance went up again. It was, one of those things where a state was backing a team, but the actual team wasn't delivering as much. So in 1985 and 1986, they were back to getting podiums with Lafitte and with René Arnoux also performing very well. But after that, again, it was just another dip. So yeah, it's a very memorable team who definitely could have achieved much more, I think, with the proper leadership and backing, because Guy Ligier was seen as someone who was very, very blunt and stubborn. So it's a shame to think that we nearly got another contender for the 80s, but they just fizzled out after 1981.
Yeah, if you look at the results, you can see that exactly what you're talking about, that peak and then that dip where they look like they really progress to 1980, where you said they got second in the championship. And then from there, they just struggle to break out of that midfield ever really again. It's interesting as well that Lafitte was with them for such a long period of time too. I mean, he must have really helped build up the team, which I suppose in this era of F1, and I would like to know your opinions on this too, it was very strange to see drivers stick with teams for such long periods of time, because people would constantly hop in and out of F1 and the market was just so unpredictable.
I feel like for Lafitte and Ligier, there was a lot of state involvement more than just the leadership of Guy Ligier, because they really wanted a French number one driver for this French team. And Lafitte was kind of the best option in the mid 70s. And then just by loyalty, they kept the same driver because, it worked. You had the same consistent point around which to develop the car. It must be said that in 1976, yes, Lafitte was the only driver, but they had considered having a second driver. They were meant to have Beltoise as well, who I think is a race winner in Monaco in 68 or 69. But in the end, they chose to only take Lafitte to fully prioritize the development around him. So it's nearly as if that team could have been called Lafitte F1 team for the first 10 years. They've really focused everything on him.
And the last question I'm going to send your way, Nav, is we've seen criticism more recently with Ferrari and how it being sort of the team of Italy and having to represent them is actually what's causing them issues because there's too much involvement from too many parties. Do you think with Ligier trying to be sort of this French F1 team, did that help or hinder them?
It helped them in terms of getting a good engine when they definitely were struggling. But the fact that Guy Ligier had to always basically talk to the president about what the team should be, I think it cannot be a good thing. It just cannot be sustainable to have the head of state of a country dictating what should happen. So there was an issue there for me in terms of leadership and just ambition. If you're a really ambitious team, you should have your own thoughts. And Yeah, the fact that the government was always pressurizing on who would be the drivers and who would be the engine supplier and who would supply the parts, because even the parts they were trying to make the parts very French as well. It shouldn't be like that. Then again, we're seeing Alpine now, who are also extremely French, but now have shareholders from loads of different countries, and then they're partly in the UK, partly in France, and that's not helping more. So yeah, you can't really say it would have been much different.
Yeah, France in Formula One, it seems like there's been a lot of investment, but it just hasn't yielded much in terms of results because we've had, I mean, they've always been there. There's been just under 100 French drivers, and you've had periods like we've mentioned the 70s and 80s, there were a lot of big names. And even in the 50s, you had like Jean Behra and Maurice Trintignant and people like that. But out of all that, we have one champion in Prost and about 14 or 15 Grand Prix winners. Most of them have only won one or two races. And you just kind of wonder why it's never quite happened, because we've seen just the investment in is that France in other branches of motorsport have always been excellent in sports car racing and Le Mans and rallying, but then Peugeot in Formula One was a complete train wreck with McLaren and then Prost, and we're seeing the state that Alpine is in now, just barely clinging to life, and you just wonder why it hasn't worked, because this again is a huge motoring and engineering country. The Grand Prix was invented in France, and we just don't have. You feel like there should be at least half a dozen more champions.
Yeah, definitely. Because in the 80s, again, being backed by the government also means having sponsors that were forced onto them. Talbot, Gitane, Seita, all of those brands associated with Ligier were apparently directly mandated by the president to go help out the French team. And the Renault engine deal was a free deal. Renault wanted to charge Ligier as they did for every other team, but they weren't allowed to do that. And of course, Ligier becomes Prost, and that was also a shambles. Yeah, it's just a shame. And again, I feel like Alpine showed a lot of potential at the start when they got Alonso, and it seemed like they had some direction. But I doubt that we will truly see success from a French F1 driver in the next few years. There aren't a lot of them coming through, so it's just a shame, really.
Moving on from Ligier, next we have March. This is a bit of a different one because while Ligier, like you said, had government and state backing, March was a bit more of a ragtag team. It had been founded by, and now I need to remember this, there was Alan Rees, Max Mosley, Graham Coker, two others where they got the name March from. But in the 70s, they had their own team, but they became kind of synonymous with basically pimping their cars out to loads of other teams and a lot of other little ones. I mean, in 76 alone, they would like they changed names a lot, but they were sending cars out to everyone else and that. But they took a win actually under Ronnie Peterson, despite that, and he'd got a pole position at the Dutch Grand Prix again, which was during Lauda's absence, which probably had an effect because outside of that, there were almost no other points scored.
Yeah, March had an interesting season this year because obviously you had Peterson in there, who was another one of those drivers who was very good but never really saw a championship, and then just a sort of on and off season, I think, as well, where sometimes they were there and sometimes they just weren't really anywhere. It's interesting to me as well. We talked about, obviously, on the slide of the P34, about how there wasn't really any other six-wheeled cars that would actually enter into Formula One. March had a go, didn't they, after the 76 season at their own six-wheeled car, and it again just nothing really came of it. But it's interesting that they're always kind of there or thereabouts. It's just a tough season for them. I don't know. I feel like P7 again in the constructors maybe wasn't reflective of where that car could have got. It just sort of got a lot of bad luck here and there, despite a strong driver lineup.
Yeah, it was always like well engineered, and they came up with some like we mentioned, the six wheeler, some very interesting looking cars. Because a couple of years before that, they had the car, that bright red one that had that weird, like sort of, it looked like the rear wing was at the front, and it looks like one of those. Whenever people in the past have tried to make like hydrofoil cars that can go on water, it has that kind of look. So they'd always just been a bit of an odd kind of ragtag team, but I think it was just limited funds, and they were definitely one of the kind of grubbier sort of kind of garagistas, I suppose is what Ferrari would have described them as. Just a bit. But yeah, just kind of a bit of a funny team because they gave cars that they lent cars out to so many other teams to use.
It's funny how, a bit like Ligier, the start of their history was when they were the most successful, and they finished second or third in the standings in 1970, and then it just kind of went downhill. And they became that team famous for having Ronnie Beatson, who's one of the greats who never were, who never was, because he just never managed to get that title or even get that glistening career that many think he should have had. That win he got, though, in 1976 was not expected. He was starting in eighth, and he benefited from a lot of the main drivers retiring or just having issues. And obviously, that race was famous for Lauda coming back. James Hunt, most famously, is just spinning off and retiring. So, yeah, I think winning in a back marker, and basically what is a back marker, should always be remembered, and that was one of the numerous achievements of Peterson's career.
Yeah, the win at Monza is an interesting one because it wasn't like it was really an uncompetitive field, because I watched some of the replay of that race, and like right till the end it was quite a close battle between even the top five. You had sort of Lauda hanging on at the back, and then I can't remember exactly who, but the other three cars sort of bunched up together, and then the March slightly ahead with Peterson. You have to remember as well, the season before wasn't amazing, but you had Lella Lombardi driving for them and obviously becoming the first woman to score a half point in Formula One. So there's so much history with them. Yet, I guess post even sort of 75, they just kind of fall off a little bit and get stuck in the midfield from there. But yeah, I don't know. What are your thoughts on sort of the victory in Monza?
Just March generally after 1972, they have a lot of highlights moments. So a lot of my deeper interest in F1 came from all those top tens that the main channel used to publish between 2018 and 2021, and you would always see a March win or a March crash or a March driver doing something. So they were always there. It's for me, they were a famous team, and I didn't realize until seeing their results a few years ago that they were just very mid, just to use that term. They were never really good or consistent, but they got wins, they got random podiums, they had some incredible lineups. 1972, they had Ronnie Peterson and Niki Lauda. That might be up there as one of the most talented driver lineups ever, possibly. So yeah, just a very memorable team, but who didn't really get memorable full seasons.
Yeah, I mean, I mostly remember them for giving customer cars out. I mean, they most notably did this the following year in '77 when Williams entered. They used a March, I think a 761, or they thought it was a 761, and then they took off the extra layer of paint and realized actually it was a 721 that was even older. So that kept them going for their first year. But yeah, March, that kind of how I remember them, because they went to the early '80s and then they left again, and then they sort of came back in '92 when Leighton House became March for 1 year, and then they just pulled out again in '93, and we haven't seen them since. And by this point, one of their founders, Max Mosley, he was FIA president at this point, so he was going places long from when he'd founded March. So earlier we mentioned Fittipaldi, obviously a team founded by one champion. Well, there was another team founded by another champion that year, which was Surtees. So they had been around for several years at this point. Again, not really achieving a huge amount of success. They had made some absolutely gorgeous cars, but this one was interesting because it was sponsored by Durex, which has meant it's one of the the TS16. It's made it one of the rather more remembered, or TS19 rather, one of the rather more remembered cars for that quite distinctive livery.
I remember the first time I saw that car, it was on one of those Instagram accounts that just posts old cars that look nice, and I was certain that that was an edit because somehow I had not heard of it. And turns out, yeah, Surtees did turn up to the 1976 season with that sponsorship. It's more remembered for how at the Race of Champions in '76, Murray Walker just turns up with his entire BBC team and then gets told, yeah, we're not sure we're going to be able to cover that. And he had no idea why, as he often did, honestly, during his career. And then 1 minute before the Race of Champions starts, he gets told that, we are not going to cover this unless Surtees change the livery in the next like 5 minutes. Basically, if they don't plaster the Durex sponsorship with the loads of stickers, I think. Obviously, Surtees didn't want to do that because Durex was giving them a lot of money to be there, and Surtees needed the money. And for me, it's just ironic in an era where there were cigarette sponsorships everywhere. All betting sponsorships came later a bit, but mostly cigarette sponsorships just blasted over wings and side pods. And then you get one sponsorship of a condom company, which, when you think about it, is a good thing to advocate for. Then there's all this backlash, and eventually the BBC had to at least air the highlights of the final race when they realized, okay, we have a British driver here who could actually become a champion, and we kind of have to tell the country that there's a British guy who could become a champion in a McLaren. And that was also pressured by the fact that ITV had showed the highlights of the previous race there. So yeah, personally, I think the whole dispute was a bit fair, because 30s were fair to, get sponsorship from whatever company was making them stay in the sport in an era where, you shouldn't really have any taboo sponsorships. And the BBC were, I guess, kind of fair because, yeah, you wouldn't want kids to ask their parents, oh, yeah, what is this thing on the TV? Even though apparently asking about cigarettes is fine.
Yeah, I think they're just lucky that they didn't have that F1 Kids broadcast thing that we have now for a couple of races, where they've got those avatars. It's like, oh, they're driving the Durex Aston Martin, trying to explain that one to the kids.
Quite ironic, isn't it? Because we're back in we're back in this conversation now of what sponsorship should be allowed with the team that shall not be named on the grid this year, the Kick F1 team. And I think you'd argue that anything gambling and vaping, etc., that's been still advertised in F1 today is a lot worse than Durex. But it's kind of funny to me because this Surtees car is remembered so much for the livery and everything like that, but their actual results were just nowhere really. You had Alan Jones, who would go on to be world champion with Williams in the car, but other than that, I think they scored 7 points over the whole season, which was just nothing. And yeah, I just want to see what, we've got obviously some controversial sponsors in F1 now. Do you think that's always going to be a part of the sport? Because there was cigarettes, years before, and trying to get those banned, and now there's gambling and vapes. Is it just sort of a circle of life where there'll always be something to talk about sponsorship wise?
I think pretty much, yeah. This has always been the case. I mean, I've said this several times now that if we're not allowed to have tobacco or alcohol advertising, we shouldn't be allowed to have gambling as well for that same reason. Because now we've got, I don't even know which one's which, Steak and Kick. One of them, they got in trouble just a few days ago because one of their leading streamers got his account deleted for having sex on the stream or something. So that's one of, so now that's Alfa Romeo or Sauber or whatever they are. They've got that as their association. But yeah, like Durex, it would be different if it was like I've mentioned before, Robert Dornbos's company Kiru being sponsored, because that's sex toys. This is condoms. It's obviously advocating, safe, responsible sex rather than, other extracurricular stuff. So it's not. It's like, I suppose it would be like having advertising like alcohol-free alcohol, or even vapes, I guess, but they're controversial as well. It's a debugged version of something not quite so family friendly.
Alcohol-free alcohol has been on F1 teams recently, so that's why it's so confusing to me that, especially in the 70s, the sexual reference was so taboo, especially when it is a good one to make, when it's a safety concern thing. And it's the fact, it wasn't just, we're not just talking about a race or two weren't shown because I mentioned the Race of Champions. No, it was the entire season where the BBC were not providing highlights until the very last race because of this backmark. As Dan said, they were not on, they would not have been showed on the highlights much. They would have been somewhere at the back and not doing anything notable. Even, I think, on the race suits, I don't think they were present on there as well. So, and anyway, you wouldn't have expected many interviews with the drivers just qualifying in 11th or 12th. So it's mad that the BBC would go against an entire sport where James Hunt was having an incredible season, where McLaren were having an incredible season just because of a backmark.
Yeah, I mean, we're not supposed to talk about James Hunt, but this is setting a far better example than his entire lifestyle. Because in one sense, he would have been the perfect sponsor for Durex with his reputation. It would have made him at least look responsible. Like, you know, it's like when I'm having sex 10 minutes before the race in the back of the garage, at least I'm doing it safely, like something like that. Yeah, but
It's actually quite good. That's a good idea. He should have been driving for them, and then
he
we could have
totally
had a
should
more
have been.
competent driver.
Yeah,
More competent driver than McLaren like Peterson or something, and then we could have remembered perhaps a better driver as that 1976 champion.
But yeah, it's one of those funny sponsors that they've had. But it wouldn't even but like you mentioned overalls, it probably wouldn't have even appeared because at this time I think it was kind of a bit of a free for all with overall design. A lot of drivers had to just buy them themselves and do them because like it's a couple of years later. But Jody Scheckter's Ferrari overalls, they're white and it's just got his personal sponsors on them. It's not like the classic red and everything. So they could have got around that. But yeah, Surtees, they did have, so they were another one that had customer teams. One of those was Davina Galitsa, who drove a Surtees in one race. She was one of the many backmarkers that we had in 76. And I suppose one talking point from those two, that is that along with Lella Lombardi, that meant that it was the first season we've had with two women in it, even if one of them would never start a race. Isn't the next slide the backmarkers? So yeah, there was a lot going on here. That I mean, that's for me. That's kind of one of the two main things I mentioned is two women on the grids for the first time, and then we had the first Japanese Grand Prix at the end of the year, and so we had a few Japanese drivers entering in that with their own team. I mean, we had Maki and Kojima, which were actually full-on Japanese works teams in their own right. That were, even if they only entered for one race. So there was a lot of stuff going on at the back as well.
Yeah, this is an opportunity for me to plug your video about every Japanese F1 driver ranked. Just quickly on that, do you think it was a big watershed moment for F1 to have these Japanese drivers enter the Japanese Grand Prix? Because obviously Japan is quite important for Formula One now. There was obviously the history with Honda entering in the 60s, but you know, Japan, Brazil, those are countries that for some reason we just associate with F1 nowadays, and even newer fans will quickly associate them with F1. But at the time, there was nothing going on for them. They really had to work their way up onto the grid. And I think you're going to mention it, but those drivers who appeared in the Japanese Grand Prix, they were very good drivers locally. They were really famous there.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose Japan at this time, it was going through kind of an economic boom. Post-war, there was a huge explosion in their automotive industry, and obviously we see this today that they're one of the leading car manufacturers, and they have a huge motorsport scene. This kind of hinted at what was going to come because we had the Japanese Grand Prix on the grid for 2 years, and then it wouldn't come back again until the late 80s. And then that was when we got Satoru Nakajima in 87 became the first full-time Japanese driver. And since then, we've had a fairly steady stream of them. But these ones, so names like Kazuyoshi Hoshino, Masawi Kuwashima, Kunomitsu Takahashi, they were all really successful in like Japanese GT and saloon car racing and single-seaters. I don't think any of them had any ambitions of going international because they entered just the Japanese Grand Prix, but made no attempts at getting a seat full-time in Formula One. It just didn't. It hinted at it, but at the time they ran the race twice and had a few one-off drivers, even building entire teams where they actually build their own chassis, like Kojima and Maki, instead of just taking a March or something else. But they just didn't go anywhere with it in the end.
Yeah, Japan. It's not the first time I suppose they'd had a go at F1 because you'd had Honda already come in and give it a try, and they obviously achieved in 1967 a win at the Italian Grand Prix with Surtees, which I recently just been doing like a bit of research for a video, and I was looking into like, a bit of Honda's first era. Then they would leave in 1968, so they weren't around in this era. So I suppose that's before, because at the moment in F1, if you think Yuki Tsunoda, for example, a big reason he's in the sport is because Honda pushed for a Japanese driver with their Japanese engines. So I suppose the lack of them being one of the biggest car manufacturers, not only in Japan, but in the world, is kind of linked with the lack of Japanese drivers. And as you get more Japanese teams in the sport, they become more and more prominent. For example, when Toyota joined F1 as well.
Just one small question to either of you. Do you think it's surprising that Honda, when they were in the sport in the 60s, didn't push for a Japanese driver to at least race for one event?
I guess so. I mean, obviously there were Japanese drivers locally at the time, but maybe they just wanted to get a foothold in with some experienced drivers before they did that. I mean, the main thing I remember about Honda at that time is that they had cars made out of magnesium, which famously would go up in white hot flame and kill Joe Schlesser. Yeah, but it's always been a tricky thing, I think, Japanese drivers in general getting them in, because I think there is that geographic and sort of cultural isolation from the very European-dominated sport. And most drivers that we've had, they've even been paid drivers, or they're there because they're being backed by an engine manufacturer. So Sato and Satoru Nakajima and Tsunoda all backed by Honda. Kazuki Nakajima and Kobayashi, they're backed by Toyota. Aguri Suzuki by Yamaha. Shinji Nakano by Mugen Honda, that sort of thing. You don't really see Japanese drivers just getting in sort of their own accord, I guess. It's always with some kind of domestic backing behind them.
I think I would agree.
Yeah, and
oh, sorry.
No, go.
Okay, I was just going to answer the question as well. I think I agree with Peter that as well. In the 60s, it's probably difficult to get a Japanese driver in, because this says on the slide, the first Japanese Grand Prix wasn't until 1976. So having that access to Japan, it was probably quite small. And I imagine, like Peter said, Honda testing the water with it. They still even are to this day, and always have been. They've been very tentative with F1, haven't they? They've been very quick to pull out if things don't go their way or they're worried about it. So I think with Honda, it's difficult for them. They need to stay in for a more prolonged period of time to really sort of start seeing, I think, more Japanese drivers get pushed through by them rather than the odd one backed by the engine manufacturer.
Yeah, they're afraid of commitment, it seems, Honda especially. When Toyota, they've come nowhere near F1 for a long time now. I mean, there were talks about them giving engines to Alpha, I think, or possibly Andretti, maybe. Or no, McLaren. There were talks of them becoming engine suppliers to McLaren because they just took on... his name will come to me. That Japanese driver's just become a reserve for McLaren. But it's like maybe, well, those two, it's always been there. Maybe it's time that we saw like Nissan give it a go, or even Mitsubishi, or bring Subaru back, because they, of course, they had their famous V12 engine used by Coloni in the early 90s. But yeah, maybe it's time for another manufacturer to give it a go.
It's funny you mentioned Mitsubishi, because yeah, they are a shadow of their former self. They're not producing any sports cars anymore, and I think a lot of people are sad about it. At this stage, I feel like Hyundai might be a better choice, because they are more interested in motorsport recently. They have been more interested in motorsport recently, and in rallying, they got Cyril Abitboul, good old Mr. Renault Frenchman, as their team principal.
They're Korean, aren't they, Hyundai, I think?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
So that's what I'm saying. There's a better chance of a Korean team than a Japanese team.
I think they just made their own parody of the trailer for GTA 6 as well, so they're doing good with the social media game. Yeah, maybe we can see that for the first bit of Korean investment. I mean, there's never been maybe they would bring back the Korean Grand Prix if they want to go in with that. I wouldn't mind seeing Yongham come back.
There was Jack Aitken. Jack Aitken was technically a South Korean driver.
He's half Korean. In Formula 3, there's that Michael Shin. He's Korean. I don't know of any other Korean drivers, but they could start something up with that.
Did Aitken represent the UK? I mean, Great Britain, or yeah?
Michael Shin, I think it's one of the team represent. I can't remember, but yeah, he's got. There's some.
Jack Aitken when he.
Oh yeah, he did represent Britain, but yeah, his mum was Korean. So he didn't. Different to Albon, he didn't choose to go on that represent the Asian side.
Shame.
Yeah, but they could do Korean. Although, of course, having said that, if they do, I can guarantee you the national anthem is getting sung by either BTS or Psy if they bring the Korean Grand Prix back. It's going to be. It's going to be.
Honestly, if BTS sang it. If BTS sung it, it would get like 50 million views. I wouldn't even fault FOM for doing it. Talking about anthems, we are just saturated with the Dutch anthem. There was a Dutch theme for Dutch team for 2 seasons. At that point, speak English. At that point, called Bovo. That was a weird one as well because yes, it was representing a new country into F1, and there were loads, as you said, of weird backmarkers at the time. But yeah, they were just one example of all those backmarkers who were just there.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're the only Dutch team we've ever had in Formula One, unless I'm forgetting an extreme. Oh, except Spiker. There's always a really obvious one. I mean, that was barely against Spiker, but factory was in Britain, and it was used to be Jordan, and yeah. Yeah, other than that, but yeah, they did 6 races in '76 and finished 2 of them. Although they had no Dutch drivers. They had Larry Perkins, who was Australian, and then they did 2 races in '77 with Brian Henton, but just didn't keep it going. It's just, I think it was another one of those small teams just run out of these guys. There was 2 brothers who ran it. I think it was just run out of their garage probably or something. They were just a funny one. But yeah, I suppose I should mention them before. Obviously, the 2 women, Lombardi and Galitza, probably deserves a bit more mention because Lombardi had done essentially a full season with March in '75, where she got her half point. But then she came back here with Ram Racing, who were using Brabham chassis for 2 races, but it just didn't land. And then Galitza, she got to do a race in a customer Surtees, and again didn't qualify. But I've forgotten what company, but there was a watch company that was sponsoring her that basically got that car put together, but it just didn't land. But she'd been an Olympic skiing champion before that. But yeah, two of the examples of the 5 women we've had in Formula One at this point.
I don't know how controversial it is to say that, but I feel like a lot of the female drivers in the 70s and early 80s might actually have had a better hand and, skill set in terms of Formula One than the current bunch. Because at that point, it was very physical, but the drivers who would get in there, as you said, would be athletes in other sports or would somehow have developed a lot of strength through like just being athletes doing other things. Whereas nowadays, I always say that the biggest hurdle to female drivers and from getting into Formula One is just the strength bit. And you would expect the 70s to be even more annoying with the power steering and all the gear shifts and like that. There's so much more going on, but there was a bit less pressure on your actual body. Whereas now, you have the neck strength to have that is absolutely insane. And again, you see female drivers do really well in endurance racing, and I'm glad that is happening. And I've always said that might be the future, and it seems like it is the future for female racers. But yeah, when you just look at the 70s and 80s, the female drivers that did race usually had really good accolades outside of Formula One.
I think slightly hindered Lombardi was using the Brabham this season because she was using the Brabham with a Ford engine, and the main team were using, I think, Alfa Romeo this year. But overall, even then, it wasn't a spectacular car. And Reutemann was driving for the main Brabham team, and he suffered DNFs in nearly every race. Scored a 4th place in Spain, and that was his best finish. Even when he got a race with Ferrari in Italy, he got a 9th, which at that point still wasn't worth any points because only top 6 got handout points. But yeah, I think the Brabham of that year just wasn't a great car either, which doesn't help because realistically, we need, if there's ever going to be a woman in F1, and even in this time, to really prove themselves, they need to be handed some really good machinery to start pushing them forward, and I think sort of prove themselves a bit more.
Yeah, the women of this era, they did well considering that they were in usually not particularly good cars. They were often old and outdated and very limited funding. Because, I mean, the very first female driver, Maria Teresa de Filipis, she did a handful of races in '58 and was actually reasonably good in them. But she retired early. It was after the death of, I think it was Jean Beyra at Avis, and she was close friends with him. And after that, she decided to quit racing. But she'd been reasonably good at that point. And again, Lombardi managed to get effectively a whole season, even if it wasn't a very good car. But outside of that, she finished 2nd in class in Le Mans in 1976 with Christine Dacremont. So an all-female lineup got 2nd in Le Mans. And even Davina Galitza, she did a couple of non-championship F1 races, and she did the British F1 Championship, which was called the Aurora one, and she finished 2nd in a race, again driving that same Surtees 2 years later. So there was always just potential. It's just that it didn't I think maybe just lack of money was probably the main reason it just didn't work at the time. And these days now, obviously, we're seeing the F1 Academy and the amount of support they're getting, and it's a difficult one because I think some people a lot of people think of different reasons of why we haven't had a woman yet. But I think there's you have to as Nav mentioned, you have to start looking at kind of the physical differences that we see, how Iron Dames are doing so well in endurance racing, but single seaters it's not working really at the moment.
Yeah, definitely, and I don't think you can really consider a female champion in F1. I just honestly think it's not gonna happen. While talking about champions, there was one on the grid in one to be in 1976, Mario Andretti, who he was with Lotus for the first. I think that was his first season with Lotus, and um, it really got him going for the 1977 and 1978 seasons, which would end up being just really good seasons for him. 4 wins in 77 and 6 wins in 78, where he wins the title. In 76, he had done 2 races with the backmarker Parnelli and even got a 6th place in South Africa, which is honestly quite insane because that was not a good car. And I don't actually know why he left Lotus for 2 races. Maybe you guys know why he went to Parnelli for 2 races. But yeah, ends the season with a win in Japan in those treacherous conditions. He said that that Japanese Grand Prix in '76 was the longest and hardest race of his life, even though he had competed in the 24 hours of Le Mans twice at that point in the '60s, and obviously in loads of different categories. So yeah, Andretti really set up his rise in F1 in that season as well.
Yeah, to touch on you talking about him setting up his rise in F1 in this season, it wasn't just kind of a fluke that, Andretti joined Lotus and they started to get good. I believe at the start of the season, the Lotus was really struggling, even in like the first couple races, and qualified quite poorly, I believe, in South Africa, where Andretti wasn't with the team for that one. He was with Parnelli. But then him and Colin Chapman start to work together to sort of improve the car, and they bring it towards the front. I believe it nearly gets the win in Austria. I think it's Austria. It nearly gets the win, and it does win in Japan in the last race during that sort of awful conditions. But I was watching an interview with Sterling Moss and Mario Andretti from 1976, and we talked about in a previous video where we were talking about all the champions, and it got to Andretti and how he was. Basically, before that, he was coming into F1 and having a couple races here and there, but he was mostly focused on IndyCar and other American series. 76 is the first season, even he admitted to Moss in this interview, where he really had some goals and he was going full-time into F1. So he sort of knocked off everything American that he was doing, and he went, well, my full focus is going to be F1. He said to achieve his goals, which evidently would become winning a championship. So it's really interesting to see that once he sort of put his mind to it, the results, even in the 76 season, began to come through for him.
Yeah, I mean, by 76, the thing is, he'd been involved in Formula One since 1968. He just hadn't committed full time to it until 75. But Lotus, this was definitely quite a big slump for them because in the 60s they'd been making all these amazing cars and introducing all these new ideas and components, but then they'd use the Type 72 kind of well beyond its sell-by date, and then they were falling behind Ferrari, also McLaren, but Ferrari mostly, who were just dominating. But yeah, as we saw, 77 along comes ground effects, and then they have this brief moment of glory again that just never really comes back before they eventually pulled out in 94. Right. Well, for the first time in forever, I think it's time for us to do the DRS ranking. So, although things AFK, so we have to keep talking, or we just wait until he comes back. I don't know.
If you have anything else, go for it. But
not without going completely off topic. And
yeah.
I mean, I was just reading a bit about Andretti 1977. It's really interesting. They wanted him for Ferrari, and then Colin Chapman went to scold Enzo for trying to take him, and then Andretti had to tell Colin, "I'm only gonna stay if you give me $10,000 a point." And then Chapman had to agree. But that's 1977. It's just really interesting because I hadn't seen that before. Ferrari said, "Your offer is mine. Like, I'll pay you whatever you want." And then Colin Chapman said, basically, you son of a bitch can't steal him from me, which is insane.
That's a far cry, wasn't it? 100,000 per
Um,
point that Kimi got in 2013 or something.
Yeah, yeah. So I think that's just slight. I mean, I think it's similar to 10,000 in F1 back then. That's insane. And also the Barnelli thing, because I was like, what the hell is Barnelli? Apparently, if Barnelli didn't exist, and if they hadn't given a drive to Andretti in 1974, he would have completely let go of Formula One. So there's an article by Motorsport magazine saying how Barnelli gave Andretti a championship because he said if I don't get a drive in 74, I'm out. So yeah, I think that's something worth touching upon somewhere. That's why he drove for Bonelli in the entire 1975 season, even though they was shit. And then he goes to Lotus. So I think when he went back to Bonelli for 2 races, it was to help out, which is mad. I had never seen that. I'm just seeing that now. Yeah, when he goes to race with Bonelli in 76, it's only for him. So that Bonelli guy only set up the team for Andretti so he could race in F1 to practice for when he actually wants to win. Yeah, that's worth doing a video episode. That's mad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. For the first time in forever, I think it's time to do the DRS rankings. So for drivers, we've got Jody Scheckter. So, well, we kind of did this in one of our previous episodes, and we had to look at that ranking of every champion, giving a general assessment where he was put fairly generously. I think he's somebody that often looks better than his results because he had in his first couple of seasons he did get involved in some pretty big accidents, but then after witnessing Sever's fatal accident kind of learned to rein that in a bit, and then he put on a lot of very good performances, including in 76, particularly 77 where he was runner-up before he got his title in 79. But I'd say at least an A would be my first thought.
Yeah, it's hard to not put A for Scheckter. Only African champion, obviously, and a very good 1979 season, even though, yeah, he's remembered for that tragic 1980 title defense where he finishes 12th, I believe. So, yeah, I think you still have to put A because B would, with some of the previous drivers we've had on here, putting him on B would be like, oh, you're the same as this guy who never got any wins.
I think I would potentially have to argue B as well. I think if we're talking 76 Scheckter, he did well, especially with having to drive a car with 6 wheels. That must have been something to get used to, and even being able to bring it to obviously the win. I think overall his season was more consistent than his teammates, which is always something that's good. The 79, the only reason I wouldn't rank it as A tier was because of the Gilles Villeneuve. And in my mind, it's up to debate, but in my mind, I think that championship should have gone to Villeneuve instead of Scheckter. And it was only really because of contracts and team orders Scheckter would actually end up winning it. But I would argue B because he's still a very solid driver. And this 76 season, when you look at it, was actually really strong from him to be able to bring that car close to the fight for second place in the championship in both the constructors and drivers.
Okay, well, we've got 2 Bs to an A, so I guess that makes it a B overall. So for the track, we've got Andersdorp, which is also known as Scandinavian Raceway, which hosted the Swedish Grand Prix at the time. This is a track which it doesn't really look like much when you look at it, but I suppose the main talking points is that in 76 it gave the only win to the 6-wheeler, and then in 78 it was the sole win for the fan car, the Brabham BT 46B. So it stands out a lot more than I suppose a lot of other ones. But yeah, you look at it now and it's like, did this really host an F1 track? Because it's quite small and kind of in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, I think you mentioned like it did give some strange race winners. It was also the next year in 77, the Swedish Grand Prix would be where Ligier would win too. So evidently, like this track must have provided something different when it came to racing. But looking at it, it looks, being on it's an aircraft, isn't it? An airport. So it looks a bit like the Top Gear test track in a way. But yeah, and definitely nowadays you'd never see anything like it. But by the look of the results, it did seem to provide some good racing. So you can hover it around, I suppose, the ABC area.
It looks like a Nerf gun. It looks like those kids' Nerf guns with like huge bullets that you put on it, and that turn forwards like the handle of the thing. It's an interesting truck for sure. The last corner makes me think a bit about Austria, that like 90-degree right-hander, which seems to be quite fast, although I haven't seen the actual truck. It's yeah, it looks a lot like a GT truck more than F1, honestly. It looks like brands like the short version of Brands Hatch, not in terms of the actual layout, but just the size of it, just 8 turns and quite a simple truck. I don't think this was a very technical or difficult circuit to navigate. So I guess B, it's not bad. And as Dan said, you had interesting races taking place there.
Yeah, I mean it's not the most offensive layout, and it does have some history by giving us two very notable race winners compared to a lot of other tracks from the time. On that basis, I guess I'd give it a B.
And you, Dan? Have we
I think I
convinced
agree.
you to also join the B clan?
Yeah, I'll join the Bs. I'll give it a B as well. I think that seems fair. Yeah.
So then for the car, it's the Tyrrell P34, the six-wheeler. So yeah, very revolutionary car. One that obviously did perform reasonably well in 76, obviously by 77, not so much. And now just one that is, it's a very popular sort of relic from that period. You'll see these at motor shows and like Goodwood all the time. They'll drag this thing out. And yeah, just a very strange car from a time of a lot of innovation in Formula One.
Yeah, so I actually saw it from 30 centimeters away a few months ago at the Silverstone Festival. It's a really impressive car. And also plugging the Silverstone Festival because they just let all those old F1 cars just sit there in the garages and you can just literally put your head in the cockpit and see where the pedals are and where the gears are. It's really impressive. And yeah, having seen it in real life, I know that's where you're not sure if the DRS rankings are purely about performance or legacy, because in terms of legacy and fame, it's an S tier for sure. In terms of performance, it's between A and B. I guess the second season makes it go more towards a B, but that 1977 season severely hampered the car for what it was meant to do. The car was mostly designed for 1976, and it was extremely successful there. And I say extremely successful because going for this outrageous design and still performing should just be commended. So I would settle for an A because the legacy and the memory of this car is too important to not consider it.
I'd have to agree with Nav that the pure legacy, the pure fame of this car is worthy of S tier. But if you're looking at performance, well, 76, it was arguably just best of the rest. It could challenge, I think, the McLaren team for that spot in the constructors, but maybe that's more down to Jochen Mass's lackluster performance than it is to that car being worthy of second place in the constructors that year. So if it was purely based on performance, it would have to be, again, another one hovering around B or A. But because of that pure legacy, I would have no issue with it going in S, just because it looks amazing. It's the first time it got done, and it's so iconic. No one ever forgets the six-wheeled F1 car.
Yeah, if it had won the title, I think it's an easy S. But I think it's the kind of thing that if it had four wheels, it wouldn't really be remembered at all that much, just as the car that was third fastest and then less than third fastest in 77. But yeah, I think an A because it's let down by its performance not being as strong as it potentially could have been. But yeah, I think that draws this episode to a close. A lot to think about because obviously I guess. Yeah, and this is the whole point of the episode. 76. Everyone thinks of London Howder, Hunt and Lauda, and Rush and all of that stuff, and then you have to try and start thinking about back markers. I'm going to keep doing that one. Yeah, it's a lot to think about.
And Howder is very good.
Yeah, if there's ever if the Chinese ever make some counterfeit F1 game, they'll just change the names around, get around the copyright. And next we'll be seeing, what Hamilton and Verstappen if they do a more modern one. But yeah, there's a lot to look into, but it's teams that other than the six-wheeler usually basically get overlooked in that season because everyone just focuses in on Hunt and Lauda. Yeah,
it's a season that is insane to think about as one that was not even aired on TV in Great Britain, which was basically the country of Formula One at that point because of one back marker that had a shady sponsorship. which was apparently a big difference to all the other backmarkers who had shady sponsorship. So yeah, it's interesting to think that most people back then could only read the news about the season, and it's a very good season to review because so much went on other than Lauda Hunt.
Yeah, definitely. I would agree because, I mean, you look at this is the season everybody knows, even if you don't know too much about F1 or early F1, you know about 1976 because of Hunt and Lauda. But then you actually think about like iconic things to happen in F1, and you kind of don't draw the parallel that they happened in the same year. So you think the six-wheeler, that's very iconic in F1. You don't always think of it as alongside such a title battle, and you think the Durex sponsorship, it's like, again, something that's absolutely hilarious and iconic looking back at F1, but you also don't think of it as something that was happening alongside this title battle. So to go through all of the other stuff that is equally looked back upon in F1 as important moments, and then say, well, this also happened alongside one of the most iconic title battles we've ever seen. I think it's really good because it puts it into perspective just what F1 was like during that time.
But yeah, thank you. Thank you to Nav and Dan as ever. I'm Peter Brook. You've been listening to the DRS Train podcast. You can find us on YouTube and Spotify, and we're on Instagram and X at the DRS Train podcast. Make sure to tune in for our next episode. Stay safe, and we'll see you all next time.